I mean, it's not so much about genetics, it's more about epigenetics. And that's interesting because that opens the door to, other evolutionary mechanisms. It's not simply the simple Darwinian picture of natural selection. Becomes much more elaborated because it opens the door to environmental modification. For example, there's a very interesting theory. There's a book called Left in the Dark, which is a theory about neural evolution that talks about the environment that early hominids evolved in was originally an arboreal environment in which their diet was mainly fruits, very little meat, but mainly fruits and other plants. And the net effect, the constituents in that kind of diet was very high in neurotransmitter precursors, neurotransmitter-like substances, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, essentially the chemistry that you find in pineal functions. And his theory is that, this environment influenced by the essentially chemical ecology that these hominids were evolving in potentiated pineal functions. And those folks had a much more integrated kind of organization of their brains, where in our brains, our left brain is dominant in most people, and the right brain is the intuitive, creative brain, but it's usually the so-called inferior hemisphere. It's not, there's nothing inferior about it, but it's less accessible, right? And so most people, at least conditioned by Western civilization, are, analytical and more the left brain functions are more structured than the right brain functions, but the right brain is where the creativity is, and to a certain extent musical and mathematical abilities. This is all left brain stuff, and his theory was that these hominids in this environment had access to this, and that it wasn't a genetic effect, it was an epigenetic effect because it modified the uterine environment of the female. So the fetus grows up in this environment that's essentially modeled, or in some sense influenced from the outside, from the diet of the mother. And the mothers are living in this environment. And so that has this epigenetic effect on the development of the fetus and the brain development of the fetus. As long as that environment continues, then it goes on from generation to generation. And you don't need thousands of generations for this to manifest. You need a few generations. But then, so this fellow's theory goes, the environment changed, the climate changed, these groups moved from the forest into the savanna, and their diet changed. They started eating a lot of grains, they started hunting animals and eating a lot more meat, they invented cooking, they didn't consume so many of these fruits, and they had, the pineal potentiation was suppressed. And the steroids from their animal diet has the opposite effect. It suppresses pineal potentiation. So gradually, what we think of as neural evolution he's claiming is neural devolution, in a sense, that we lost this connection between the hemispheres gradually, and the right hemisphere came to be thought of as the inferior hemisphere, but it wasn't inferior, but we lost access to it in a certain sense, and that changed our whole relationship. We lost access to a whole bunch of functions that, for example, maybe things like telepathy, or just more intuitive integration with our environment. And as this continued, and it's only continued in our time as our diet has gotten worse and worse. Now our diet, the typical modern diet, has almost no relationship to nature. It's all processed foods and all that. So this is what, since this connection was lost, these somewhat less desirable traits having to do with our left brain fixations have become dominant. But the brain of modern humans is actually about only about 3/4 the size of Neanderthals, for example.
Our brain has shrunk.
Our brain has shrunk. Yeah. Now you have to take into account body mass and all that, because talking about brain size without talking about body mass is it doesn't make any sense, right? Because an elephant's brain is a lot bigger than ours, and so on. But they are not particularly intelligent. They're not intelligent enough to do what we do, which is create culture and language and all that. But that this relationship, over time has accelerated, and we become more and more estranged from the kind of functions that the right brain. It's not that it's not going on, it's just it's more in the background, and we're not always accessible to it. So a lot of these spiritual practices, psychedelics, meditation, various kinds of integrative things are techniques to try to re-establish this connection, to try to re-establish this, and potentially, the implications of his theory is that you could also, over time, if you were to change the environment, you could reestablish this and perhaps recover from this neurodegenerative disease that we have, which is known as civilization.
Or Western civilization.
Right. So.
All right. So this summarize what this last piece that you're saying. Basically, as our diet changed, we devolved from having a more integrated left-right hemisphere existence, and that led to a dominance of our left brain, which leads to male dominance,
exactly.
Anal thinking.
Exactly. All of those things.
And a war culture.
And a more or less suppression of the right brain by the left brain. The left brain kind of took over the executive functions, and the right brain, being the right brain, wasn't particularly interested in that anyway. So, okay, you guys go run things, and I'll just be here as the source of, all creativity and insight and all that. I don't know if it's
true.
True. It's a reasonable theory. And it explains a few things. One of the things about evolutionary theory or evolutionary biology that's always puzzled me, and this is kind of my main wrap for tonight's talk, and my main wrap in general, is that because of this plant communication system that works throughout the ecosystem, and it works on everything in it that interacts with plants, it just makes sense that secondary products, which work often at the genomic level and various levels, had an influence on evolution. in terms of the way that we adapted to this chemical environment.